to another episode of 6 Degrees of Associations. I do have to say thank you for your patience during our post or late summer hiatus. Lucas and I both had personal and professional things to attend to. So this is our first episode in probably a month now, Lucas. I'm excited to dive in.
Feels like I've been on the road and up in the air for 3 months, even though it was
exactly. I mean, meetings and conventions have come back in full swing. Jeff, you were just mentioning you were at ASAE in Tennessee, right? You guys were in Tennessee?
Yeah, we were both there.
A couple weeks ago. Yeah, small world. Although that's what we find out on this podcast, that the association world is in fact a small world. So we are excited to welcome Jeff Tenenbaum today. He is an attorney in the association space, but I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to let him introduce himself. But we're excited to have him here to talk about, once again, a completely different field of conversation than we've ever had out of 45 episodes. It's still crazy that we can approach new topics every time. So Jeff, without further ado, would you mind introducing yourself for our audience?
Sure. It's not too bad that you went through 45 episodes without coming to a lawyer, so that's not bad.
Exactly right. But you're necessary, so.
Glad to be on your program. So I'm an attorney in private practice in Washington, D.C., managing partner of Tenenbaum Law Group. We're a 4-lawyer, 1 paralegal boutique law firm that focuses exclusively on the representation of associations and other nonprofits, primarily as outside general counsel. I spent most of my legal career, 19 years, chairing the nonprofit practice at a large law firm called Venable. We started this firm beginning of 2020 to be able to do this on a smaller scale, kind of boutique basis, with all of the advantages that a small firm brings, which has resonated very, very well in the association community. We represent about 550 nonprofit organizations right now, primarily national organizations. Probably about 60% of them are trade and professional associations, and the other 40% are other types of nonprofit organizations, primarily 501c3s. We work with associations that have in-house lawyers, many that don't, small, medium, very large size organizations all over the place. And we deal with a very broad array of all of the different legal issues that associations face. I actually got my start in this field working at ASAE and the public policy division, and later managing the legal section when I was going to law school at night after a few years of working on Capitol Hill. That's how I discovered the world of associations and association law. And 26 years later, I've been doing nothing but that. And it's been a very fun ride. And I love the field. I love the association community. I live and breathe it like you guys do. And anyway, happy to be with you guys here today.
It's hard not to stumble into them in our area.
Yeah, the DC area, certainly. I was about to say, we might need to have you back on as a business development expert to go starting your company in 2020 and having 550 associations. Way to go. That's pretty spectacular.
I was a little concerned, 2.5 months in when the pandemic hit. I didn't know what was going to happen, but now we've grown quite rapidly. And part of the reason we grew so rapidly in 2020 is, as you know, association meetings and conventions were all shut down, mostly because states and cities and counties across the country were banning large gatherings. And so that's an area of law that I've always done a ton of work in terms of meeting and convention contracts and whatnot. So I got out there and started with ASAE, was on a big webinar that they did, and then ended up doing tons of other webinars and writing articles all about kind of meeting contracts and COVID and how can you get out of your contracts without paying massive cancellation penalties. And we probably brought in about 150 association clients in 2020 who just on those issues who wanted our help. We were very successful in getting virtually all of them out of their contracts or rolling over to future years without having to pay cancellation penalties. And then many of those associations really like the work that we did and how we do it and how cost efficient we are. And many of them now use us as kind of their primary outside counsel. So while the pandemic was horrible and remains horrible in so many respects, there was that silver lining for our law. And so we've grown quite rapidly.
That's pretty amazing. Congratulations. I mean, in any disruption, whether it's a good one or a bad one, often it's great to see that people pull that disruption into creative disruption and create a market for themselves. So that's awesome. Congratulations. So speaking about associations, so Lucas is heavily involved in associations. I sort of play his weird sidekick that isn't always in the business. And so I am so curious when someone says association law, like, tell me, give me like 5 top hot button issues that you're working on in the association, in the legal world of associations.
So when I say association law or nonprofit law, when you go to law school, most schools don't have any class on nonprofit law or association law, because what it really is it's more of an industry focus. It's not an area of law focus. So I view association law as how do dozens and dozens of areas of law uniquely affect associations, right? So associations deal with all different legal issues. Some of the legal issues that they deal with are really no different than for-profit companies. Probably employment law is the most common example. Right. We do have some unique issues in terms of volunteers and interns, but in the role of boards of directors that sometimes touches on employment law. But there's no separate employment law for associations versus for-profit companies. But in many other areas of law, there are a lot of unique differences. Like we just talked about meetings and contracts. So all associations, for-profits deal with contracts all the time, deal with meeting contracts, but kind of the association meeting and conference contracts it's kind of a unique animal. It's very unique and specific, and they're very different from other sorts of contracts. So that's one area that's very unique. There's a whole section of the federal tax code that's dedicated to tax exempt organizations. Most associations are about 2/3 of all associations are exempt under section 501c6. About 1/3 are exempt under 501c3. And so they're very much regulated by the tax code, limitations, prohibitions, reporting requirements, unrelated business income, limitations on excessive compensation for executives, things like that. So that's very unique to associations, and especially the rules for 501c6s, are very different for associations. Other areas of law, even things like antitrust issues have a very unique application in the association space, because associations are combinations of competitors. They automatically trigger one of the requirements for an antitrust violation under some of the principal federal and state antitrust laws, like the Sherman Act and the FTC Act. And so associations have always had to do a lot to mitigate risks in the antitrust area when it comes to things like price fixing and group boycotts, market allocation, other things like that, association certification and accreditation programs, member codes of ethics, enforceable codes of ethics. These things bring in significant antitrust risks. So we do a lot of work in that area. Even intellectual property, copyrights and trademarks come into play in all different areas, but protecting your copyrights and trademarks, licensing them, not infringing others. And there's a lot of unique applications in the association space. We deal with contract reviews. We deal with the regulation of lobbying and political activity. We deal with defamation issues. We deal with a lot of corporate governance and bylaws, codes of ethics, conflicts of interest. These are things that we're dealing with all of the time in the association law space. So it really covers the gamut of so many areas of law, some unique to associations, some not. But associations have to deal with these. And part of the reason I think I and we as our firm have been so successful is not only do we know the areas of law very well, but we have a really deep understanding of associations, how they operate, what makes them different, the politics, the culture, the role of the board. And so being able to give really good practical advice that takes that broader context into consideration really helps make us a lot more effective as association lawyers.
I feel like I just drank from the fire hose, Jeff.
It
sounds like you have an arrow in your quiver for just about everything. I think they're expanding internationally in a lot of ways. It's becoming easier to just communicate globally. Mergers and acquisitions are becoming a hot topic, and the legal ramifications between forget that you think smashing two cultures together, but then smashing two 501c3s or other legal type entities together can be pretty messy. So I imagine navigating an organization through that has its own.
These are other great examples of areas that we do a lot of work in. We do a lot of, what some people call M&A work, mergers and acquisitions, but I'm working on probably a half dozen right now, some involving C6 and C3 combinations, some involving two C6s coming together. Sometimes it's a true legal merger. Sometimes it's more of an asset transfer and dissolution. Sometimes it's kind of two organizations kind of teaming up to figure out how to do things together, working on a couple of those right now. And understanding all the law, it involves federal tax law. Oh, another key area is associations are almost all of them are nonprofit corporations. And so every state in DC has a nonprofit corporation statute, which very much regulates the organizations. That comes into play in mergers and combinations. But even knowing that, the culture of nonprofits and how they operate, having been down every issue that we deal with, I've literally dealt with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So even in these merger discussions, I find myself not just giving legal advice on the different options of different structures, pros, cons, considerations, but being able to kind of say, this type of approach, even how the two sides are going to negotiate the deal and who's going to, be representing each side. Do you have the whole board involved? Do you have a smaller group? Who should be on that group? Same thing goes for making a big overhaul of your bylaws. Having done this so many times, I'm able to, point associations to good practices, best practices, things that work well, things that tend to have a lot of pitfalls. If you're not bringing, the full board or the membership along in the process, that can sometimes come back to bite you. So just knowing the politics, the culture, the context really helps make our advice that much more effective.
Well, and we see this on I'll call it the supplier side of one of our organizations at Affinity. We see suppliers that want to come in and work with associations who really know nothing about associations. And you need to understand the greater mission of that organization and how they really operate in order to be able to really send and communicate with them through the lens of, sort of their language. There is sort of a language to associations, right, that you'd speak. So you could come in and somebody in corporate America could speak about those same things, mergers and acquisitions, and here are all the legal ramifications. But having sort of a partner on their side that understands and has been essentially in their seat or driven alongside somebody who's been in their seat has to have a huge benefit, I would imagine.
No question about it. And you say like the association itself, but the association is really, obviously it's people, but it's, the staff and management play a very different role from the board. And
right.
The board plays a very different role from the broader membership, assuming it's a membership organization like most associations are. And even the board versus the role of the executive committee and other committees, and then the members and then the staff. Like I do a lot of association board kind of governance and legal trainings. And those are some of the things that I talk about, understanding the role of those different groups and how kind of an effective association that operates effectively. I believe, each of those groups has to know where their lane is and stay in the lane. And like if you have the board doing committee work, that's not going to work well. If you have the board micromanaging the CEO and other staff, that's not going to work well. And so understanding how all of those things should work really helps to make even like a merger or any sort of combination that much more successful.
Yeah. Is there anything? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking, the meetings and conventions, that makes sense. 2020 uprooted a bunch of those plans, lots of contracts to dig through. Are there any other unique situations that came out of the COVID pandemic that have altered legal ramifications for associations that you've just been dealing with time and time again over the last 2 years?
Absolutely. One, probably we spent most of 2020 saying two words every day, many, many times a day: force majeure. It's the provision in most contracts. It says if some unforeseen event happens that makes it illegal or impossible or sometimes commercially impracticable for you to fulfill your obligations under the contract, then you can get out without penalty, without cancellation penalties, right, which are almost always written into these meeting contracts. But then 2021 comes around, vaccines start to come online. Some of our association clients started to have in-person meetings again. Obviously that continued, as 2021 rolled on, and then certainly into 2022. And thankfully, in-person meetings and conventions are very much back. I find myself on the road constantly going to different meetings. And it's very refreshing. But in 2021, the big issue was, how can we put on in-person meetings and conferences safely from a liability risk in protecting our attendees and our staff in the midst of a global pandemic that was still very much ongoing. So pivoted from a lot of speaking presentations on cancellation and force majeure to things like vaccine requirements, liability waivers. What sort of protocols do you have to have in place at your meetings in order to protect everyone and mitigate your liability risk? What sort of obligations do you want to put on the hotels and the convention centers to make sure that they're doing to protect everyone? And that was a massive area of focus. That's kind of really tapered off at this point, but through much of 2021, every day, constantly on the phone with clients and giving webinars on other things on those issues. In 2020, there were a lot of clients that we helped with respect to governance issues in the midst of a pandemic. So a lot of associations did not have provisions in their articles of incorporation or their bylaws to allow, membership meetings to happen remotely, or to allow electronic voting by members or things like that. And some of the state nonprofit corporation statutes, they're all over the place. Some, like New York, the New York Attorney General, issued an emergency rule, or maybe it's the governor's office. The governor, issued an emergency rule to allow for remote meetings of members of nonprofits, even though the statute did not allow for it. So wrote a long article all about those kind of governance challenges during the pandemic. And since, of course, have wrapped that into our work that we do in terms of bylaw reviews and other things for associations.
And if you, I think also, because I know Aaron's going to wrap us up here any second, but I want to kick the rock down the road, 5+ years, Jeff, and things that are relevant today that I would say associations may be just catching up on and maybe a little bit more mainstream. Are there those issues within associations that you're starting to think about, like metaverse and blockchain and NFTs, the liabilities and exposure? Are you having any of those conversations yet with associations? Or are we still 5 years away?
Not really. For some of the charities, we get into, like gift acceptance policies. Will you accept, certain types of alternative currencies and things like that? Some will, some won't. But really, not really so much in the association world yet. But one other good example, Aaron, to follow on your question, where we've done a lot of work over the last 2 years is workplace reopenings. In the midst of the pandemic. How can you do this safely? Again, vaccine requirements, exceptions that are required under the Americans with Disabilities Act to make reasonable accommodations for people that have qualifying disability. What sort of protocols you're going to have in the office? That was a huge area of focus of ours.
Sure. Yeah. And as a person who has recently been diagnosed with long COVID, I can only imagine now, what are you thinking about as far as the ramifications of the pandemic as the virality of it slows down, but the repercussions of it and what do companies need to do as far as long-term disability and such. So as Lucas said, go ahead.
When I follow on Lucas' question, we've talked about some of the hot button issues that have arisen, during the pandemic. But I get asked this a lot, what are the new developments in association law? And there always are some things, but to be frank, I've been doing this a long time. Most of the, the issues that we deal with now are the issues I was dealing with 26 years ago. The core laws in this area really don't change much. The tax code, there were a number of changes in the 90s that affected associations with corporate sponsorships and the lobbying tax law, and new guidance in terms of royalties that came out from court rulings and things like that. But most of the stuff doesn't really change much. All these, the state nonprofit corporation statutes get amended. There's a new version of the Model Nonprofit Corporation Act that's about to come out, and that'll require changes. The states will make changes, and then bylaws will need to be amended. But so many of these issues, the antitrust laws haven't changed in over 100 years.
Right.
And the way to enforce them with associations really hasn't changed. Employment laws, sometimes there's new laws that come on the books. In DC, we have a paid family leave, law that took effect, but most of the stuff really doesn't change very much. So, basic contract law issues and negotiation strategies and everything else. And so while there are some new developments all the time, most of what we counsel clients on really doesn't change very much.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like I could go to law school now, and there's so much that we could have picked up on
there.
We
have a lot to learn at law school. Apparently.
We have a lot to learn. But this has been a great 15-minute sort of quick fire session with you, Jeff, to open up the world and the aperture for our audience to see what do they need to be potentially consulting you about if they haven't thought about it just yet. But thank you so much.
One other thing I did want to tell your audience, if you're interested in any of these issues, we have a ton of resources on our law firm's website, far more than most big law firms do when it comes to association law. We have, if you go to tenenbaumlegal.com, which is our website, there's a tab for publications where we have hundreds of articles and PowerPoint presentations on all of these different legal issues that I've talked about. We also have a tab now, especially since the pandemic and kind of the Zoom and everything else coming in full force into the association world, there's actually hundreds of recorded webinars on there and all of these different topics. So there's different tabs for those things, but if you're interested, and we're constantly posting new stuff as well. So be sure to check that out.
That's great. That's awesome. Do you have, to wrap us up, do you have anyone that you think our audience might benefit from hearing from that's in your network that perhaps we might not have spoken with before that you would recommend?
I have a lot. I have a big network.
Okay. Great. Give us one.
Let me give it some thought, and I will follow up with you guys.
Okay, great. We will post that in the LinkedIn post. But Jeff, this has been wonderful. Thanks so much for your time. I know it's important, and we'll get the $300 bill. What? $700 bill later. How many minutes did we take?
This is pro bono.
Just kidding. Pro bono. Just kidding, everybody. I just scared Lucas.
I feel honored, bad.
Thank
you, Jeff.
A little lawyer joke.
Right, thank you,
Jeff. Really appreciate it.